You're someone who wants to get a real handle on important topics, understand what's going on without getting lost in endless reports, right?
Uh-huh.
That's exactly why we're here. Today, we're diving deep into something that affects, well, pretty much all of us. Why the cost of building things, especially public transit here in Canada, seems to just keep going up and up.
It definitely feels that way.
Yeah, and we've gathered a whole range of information, from detailed studies looking at where our transit dollars are actually going, to government plans for infrastructure, and even a look at how other countries tackle these projects.
Great.
Our mission today is basically to give you the clear takeaways.
Hmm.
Why are these costs rising? And what potential solutions are the experts actually talking about?
Absolutely. And we're aiming to go beyond just, listing the numbers. What's really fascinating here is trying to uncover the reasons behind these cost increases. And crucially, as you said, highlighting what the sources suggest could be done differently. Think of this as your quick but pretty comprehensive guide to understanding this whole critical issue.
Okay, great. So let's maybe unpack this a bit.
Mm-hmm.
What immediately grabs your attention from one of the studies is just the sheer scale of the cost increases,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for building transit in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Toronto, specifically, has seen a really dramatic jump in the price tag for rapid transit projects, especially since about 2002.
Yeah, the numbers are quite stark.
And the study emphasizes this isn't just a Toronto story, right? Lots of Canadian cities are seeing the same trend.
Exactly. Which puts our transit construction costs per kilometer among the highest
Yeah.
globally.
Wow.
Yeah. And the central insight from this particular study isn't just that we're paying more, but that these high costs, well, they aren't necessarily set in stone.
Okay.
The researchers argue pretty strongly that a major factor is our current approach to these projects, what they actually call our project delivery regime.
Project delivery regime, which makes you wonder if there's a better way, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Because the study throws out a really startling comparison. It mentions the transit cost project and points out that similar transit projects in other parts of the world, they mention places like Istanbul, Italy, can be built for as little as 1/10 of what it costs per kilometer here in Canada.
1/10.
1/10. I mean, that really makes you stop and think, what on earth are they doing differently?
Exactly. It just raises this crucial question about efficiency. Are we actually adopting global best practices?
Right.
The study we're focusing on looked really closely at this. They analyzed cost breakdowns, qualitative reports, particularly in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, the GTHA.
Okay.
But they also did a really broad review of research on transit construction costs and different project delivery methods all around the world, trying to understand why these massive differences exist.
So based on all that research, what are the key factors driving up these costs here? And I guess more importantly, what do they suggest we could actually change?
Well, the study's main conclusion is pretty blunt. They say our current project delivery regime is, and this is their term, antithetical to global best practices.
Ouch.
Antithetical. Yeah. And one of their primary recommendations to fix this is for Canadian transit agencies to really develop and strengthen their own in-house expertise.
Okay, explain that.
Mm.
Why is having that internal knowledge base, that expertise, so important?
Well, the logic is quite strong, actually. When you have skilled professionals inside the public sector, people who are deeply involved in the projects, making key decisions, it just builds greater confidence in the cost estimates.
Uh-huh.
They're better positioned to manage what people often call soft costs.
Soft costs.
Things like changes to the project after it's already started, scope creep, and the delays those changes inevitably cause. By having that internal understanding, you're less reliant on, say, external consultants for every little thing.
And relying heavily on outside consultants, that can really add to the expense, can it? I think I remember seeing something about that in a Metrolinx audit.
Precisely. You hit it. That audit highlighted instances where the process for hiring subconsultants wasn't maybe as competitive as it could have been.
Right.
And this led to pretty significant additional costs and markups. So the study suggests that by boosting in-house capabilities, public agencies can become, more informed clients.
Like a smart client.
Exactly, smart client. Manage projects more effectively and hopefully ultimately achieve cost savings. The key insight here is that being that smart client with internal knowledge is crucial for controlling costs, rather than just sort of outsourcing all the expertise.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the role of the private sector in all this? We hear a lot about public-private partnerships PPPs.
Right, or AFPs, sometimes alternative financing and procurement.
Yes, those. Where do they fit into this cost picture, according to these sources?
The study presents a more nuanced view here. They're not necessarily saying no private sector involvement.
But they strongly emphasize that even when you do contract private companies, a strong public sector absolutely needs to be at the forefront of the project management.
Leading the charge, so to speak.
Pretty much. They recommend breaking down big projects into smaller contracts, having very clear goals and deliverables for each, and keeping a really close watch on the overall scope. So it's not a simple public versus private thing.
Right.
It's about having a competent, knowledgeable public sector leading the way, regardless of the specific contracting method you choose.
That makes a lot of sense. You need someone with that deep understanding, really overseeing things, ensuring accountability, keeping costs in check.
Exactly.
Now, zooming out a bit, we know Canada's cities are growing fast, so investing in transit infrastructure is clearly essential, right?
Absolutely vital.
And we've seen big announcements of significant new funding recently, federally and provincially. How does this broader context of infrastructure investment in Canada tie into the challenges, the cost challenges we're discussing? Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a primer on Canadian public transit governance that points this out. Increasing the capacity of our urban transit systems is becoming more and more critical given our growing urban populations.
Right.
And yes, there's been this surge in rapid transit construction fueled by new funding, but, and this is a big but, this comes at a time when transit systems are also facing pretty serious financial pressures on their day-to-day operations.
Because of ridership drops during the pandemic.
Largely, yes. Reduced ridership during, say, 2020 to 2022 really hit operating revenues hard. So you have this strong push for new building alongside these big financial challenges for just running the existing services.
And that primer you mentioned, it really emphasizes the importance of governance in all this, doesn't it? How we actually organize and manage public transit at a higher level.
Precisely. It argues that effective governance is just fundamental. You need it to successfully manage both the building of new infrastructure and the ongoing operational demands.
Makes sense.
And it highlights the very different approaches to transit governance we actually see across Canada.
Oh, yeah, like the comparison between, say, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal.
Yes, exactly that. Vancouver, with TransLink, operates under a more integrated regional authority model. And critically, TransLink has its own local revenue-generating powers, like taxing authority. And the primer suggests this has led to a more, let's say, streamlined and orderly process for developing new rapid transit lines there.
Compared to Toronto.
Compared to Toronto, yeah, which has a much more fragmented system. You've got multiple local and provincial players involved, and its transit development has historically been quite politicized.
Right, I remember hearing about canceled plans and reversals.
Exactly, leading to delays and big changes in plans. Then there's Montreal, which the primer mentions almost as this interesting side case, a city that seemingly built bargain rapid transit.
Bargain rapid transit. How?
Well, unfortunately, our current sources don't really dive into the how for Montreal. It just sort of flags it as notable.
That definitely makes you wonder. But let's dig a bit deeper into the challenges in Toronto then. The Metrolink's Eglinton Crosstown LRT project, that seems to be a key illustration of some of the difficulties with project management and those AFP contracts we mentioned.
It really is.
What were some of the specific issues that came up there?
Yeah, the Metrolinx audit we touched on earlier really shines a light on this one. They identified pretty persistent design problems with the AFP consortium, that's the private group responsible for building the Eglinton Crosstown.
Okay.
Metrolinx apparently repeatedly expressed concerns about the quality of the designs being submitted.
But the consortium?
Well, initially the consortium kind of resisted addressing these concerns, even while apparently maintaining they'd still meet the original project completion date.
Not ideal.
Not at all. The key takeaway from this example is really how design flaws and these contractual issues can spiral into significant delays and added costs, even within these supposedly risk-transferring public-private partnerships.
And that completion date, it kept getting pushed further and further out, didn't it?
Exactly. What was initially targeted for September 2021, that eventually got revised to May 2022. And even then, Metrolinx pointed out that the consortium wasn't providing the detailed work schedule narratives that were actually required by the contract.
So lack of detail, ongoing design issues.
Yeah, there were even concerns raised at one point that some infrastructure was being constructed without full design approval.
Wow. And then there was that big financial settlement Metrolinx had to pay out, wasn't there?
Yes, that's right. A $237 million settlement was paid to the AFP consortium. Essentially, the purpose was to ensure they adhered to that original, albeit delayed, completion timeline.
So much for transferring risk.
Well, this situation certainly suggests that the risks weren't as fully transferred to the private sector as the AFP model is kind of intended to achieve.
Right.
And the audit also flagged significant problems with a separate contract, the Bombardier light rail vehicle contract, missed deadlines, quality issues. Metrolinx even tried to cancel the contract at one point.
And that cost money, too.
Oh, yeah. $25 million in external costs incurred just as a direct result of those vehicle delays.
It sounds like just a whole series of interconnected problems. And these issues, they even had knock-on effects on other projects, correct?
They did indeed. Because of all the difficulties with Bombardier on Eglinton, Metrolinx actually had to consider transferring the responsibility for managing the delivery of light rail vehicles for another project, the Hurontario LRT, to whoever won that project's AFP contract.
Just shifting the problem almost.
It demonstrates the kind of far-reaching consequences that can ripple out from problems with one single major contract.
Okay, so it's clearly not just about the type of contract we use, AFP, traditional, whatever, but also about how effectively we manage them, how we ensure accountability from the contractors.
That seems to be a huge part of it.
Now, another important factor that often comes up with these huge infrastructure projects is the impact on the environment. How do environmental impact assessments, EIAs, play a role in all of this?
Right, EIAs, they're a critical part of the process, absolutely. They're meant to ensure that the potential environmental consequences of these really large-scale projects are thoroughly considered before shovels hit the ground.
So standard procedure, basically.
Pretty much. You've got frameworks like the EC Directive on EIAs in Europe or NEPA in the US, that's the National Environmental Policy Act.
Yeah.
Both require assessments that look at potential environmental impacts, any unavoidable negative effects, the project's impact on long-term productivity, and any irreversible commitments of resources like land or water.
And these assessments, they can sometimes lead to, well, let's just say additional complexities or delays.
They certainly can. Litigation related to, say, violations of NEPA, that does happen, particularly sometimes with energy projects.
Right.
And the length of time it takes just to obtain the necessary permits can vary, sometimes depending on whether a project is publicly or privately financed. Canada, of course, has its own Impact Assessment Act, which outlines the specific processes here for evaluating the effects of designated projects.
So environmental reviews are definitely a factor that can influence both the timeline and potentially the overall cost of these big infrastructure projects.
Absolutely. It's a necessary step, but it does add layers to the process.
Okay. Shifting focus slightly, again, another piece of this puzzle seems to be the actual efficiency of the construction sector itself. There's mention in the sources of a study comparing Quebec and Ontario. What did that comparison find?
Ah, yes, that study. It put forward an argument that Quebec's construction sector might experience somewhat lower productivity compared to Ontario's.
Why?
Potentially due to, well, what this study described as more complex regulations and also a significantly greater number of distinct recognized trades in Quebec. Something like 25 compared to Ontario's 6 compulsory and 12 optional trades.
25 different trades.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the suggestion was that increasing the versatility of trades, what they called polyvalence, allowing workers to perform a wider range of tasks, could potentially lead to a significant recovery of essentially lost work hours, more efficiency on site.
That sounds like a pretty direct way to improve efficiency, doesn't it?
Hmm.
But was there another side to that coin, another perspective on the comparison?
Interestingly, yes. When the researchers looked at productivity measured differently using constant dollars, which adjusts for inflation, they found that Quebec's performance actually looked much more competitive nationally.
Oh.
Yeah, and at times even surpassed the Canadian average. So it highlights that simply counting the number of trades might not give you the full picture. Other economic factors clearly play a really significant role in overall productivity levels.
It's almost always more complicated than it first seems, isn't it?
Usually is.
Now, let's circle back quickly to those public-private partnerships, the PPPs. Canada has often been described as a leader in this area, right?
At time, yes.
What exactly do these partnerships involve, generally speaking, and have they typically been seen as successful in, say, controlling costs?
Well, PPPs can cover a really broad spectrum. It can range from fairly minimal private sector involvement all the way up to arrangements where the private sector takes on pretty much everything: design, build, own, operate, and finance the whole thing.
The full package.
Exactly. And Canada, particularly through the agency PPP Canada, which operated between about 2008 and 2018, really did embrace this approach quite enthusiastically.
Right.
There's a claim cited that over 200 PPP infrastructure projects have been completed in Canada, representing a huge amount of capital investment. And there were some reported savings compared to traditional public procurement methods, at least according to the proponents.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Are there potential downsides or challenges to consider with the PPP model? What do the sources highlight?
Well, yeah. One source, looking at the experience in China, for instance, emphasizes the absolutely critical need for a very robust, very clear legal framework for PPPs. That's needed to attract private investment in the first place and ensure projects are actually profitable for them.
Makes sense. Investors need certainty.
Exactly. And they raise concerns about governments maybe not always fully adhering to contract terms, which erodes trust. And closer to home, we also saw that PPC Canada was actually discontinued by a new federal government back in 2016.
Oh, right. And replaced by the Canada Infrastructure Bank.
Yes, which itself has faced its own share of scrutiny and criticism. This kind of policy uncertainty, governments changing direction, that can definitely pose a challenge for attracting stable, long-term infrastructure investment, regardless of the model.
It really sounds like having clear, stable, predictable rules of the game is essential for any approach, whether it's primarily public, primarily private, or some kind of mix.
Consistency seems key.
Now, thinking about the money side again.
Yeah.
These infrastructure projects represent absolutely massive investments, often financed through long-term debt.
Hmm.
What are the longer-term financial implications for governments taking these on?
Yeah, you're right. These investments do create an asset on the government's balance sheet, especially since governments adopted accrual accounting. So you see the asset side grow. However, the way they're financed certainly impacts the level of public debt. If you look at the Quebec Infrastructure Plan, the QIP, for example, it's seen a really significant increase in the funds allocated to it over the years. Big spending.
Right.
But at the same time, Quebec, like many places, is facing a growing deficit maintien d'actifs DMA. That translates roughly to the growing backlog of necessary upgrades and repairs needed for existing infrastructure, stuff that's getting old.
The maintenance deficit.
Exactly. So while new investments are adding to the asset side on paper, there's also this increasing need, this growing cost, just to maintain what's already been built.
And how does all this spending, new build plus maintenance, affect government budgets in the years after the construction finishes?
Well, these infrastructure investments impact future budgets mainly through two things: amortization and interest. Amortization is basically accounting for the gradual wear and tear, or the using up of a major asset like a subway line over its expected lifespan.
Spreading the cost over time.
Exactly, spreading the cost in the government's books over many years. And then, of course, there are the ongoing interest expenses on the debt that was taken out to finance the projects in the first place.
Which can be substantial.
Can be very substantial over decades. Quebec actually has a unique piece of legislation, the Loi sur la réduction de la dette et instituant le Fonds des générations, the Generations Fund law. It's specifically designed to try and manage the impact of infrastructure reinvestment on the province's overall debt levels.
Interesting. So they're actively trying to structure things to balance the need for infrastructure with, long-term fiscal responsibility.
That seems to be the goal, yes. A specific mechanism to address that tension.
Now, let's just take a very brief look at the global context. Are other countries facing similar kinds of challenges when it comes to infrastructure investment needs?
Oh, absolutely. Globally, the need for infrastructure investment is just huge. The electricity and road sectors usually represent the largest areas of need worldwide.
Okay.
And generally, there's a pretty significant gap identified between current investment levels and what experts estimate is actually needed, particularly for things like roads and ports.
So underinvestment is common.
In many areas, yes. And you see some interesting differences in priorities, too. China, for instance, invests a much, much larger proportion of its GDP in inland infrastructure compared to, say, North America or Europe.
Right.
And in Europe, some countries like Austria and Great Britain actually allocate more investment to rail infrastructure than they do to roads, which is often the reverse here.
It really highlights that different countries have different priorities, different strategies, different historical context driving their choices.
Definitely. No single global standard.
And what about the inherent risks involved in these often massive, sometimes international infrastructure projects. What do the sources say about that?
Well, particularly for overseas construction projects, there's a really wide range of risks that need careful management. You've got political stability risks, economic conditions, cultural differences that can impact work, environmental concerns, market fluctuations, legal and regulatory frameworks. It's a long list.
Yeah, sounds like it.
And the perception of these risks can vary significantly depending on the region you're talking about. For instance, political risk might be seen as a much bigger concern in the Middle East, whereas environmental risks might be the absolute top focus for a project in the Arctic.
So risk management isn't one size fits all.
Not at all. Strategies need to be very specifically tailored to the unique context of each project and its location.
Okay. Finally, let's bring it right back home to Canada one last time. Taking everything into account, how competitive is Canada seen as a place for infrastructure investment compared to other developed nations?
Well, unfortunately, some sources suggest Canada's reputation as a really desirable destination for infrastructure investment has actually declined somewhat in recent years.
Oh, really? Compared to who?
Compared to other G7 countries and also Australia, the main reasons cited tend to be regulatory hurdles and bureaucratic delays, things just taking too long.
The red tape argument.
Pretty much. And also that policy uncertainty we talked about earlier, with priorities sometimes shifting quite significantly when new governments come in.
Right. Which isn't great for long-term, multi-billion-dollar projects.
Not at all. And this matters because transportation and warehousing infrastructure specifically are seen as absolutely key drivers of our national productivity and overall economic competitiveness. And Canada's labor productivity, generally speaking, does lag behind the US and most of our G7 peers.
So we need efficient infrastructure to help close that gap.
Exactly. The fact that Canada apparently lacked a really comprehensive long-term national transport infrastructure strategy framework until fairly recently also probably hasn't helped create that stable environment investors look for.
But there is some good news.
On a more positive note, yes. Canadian pension funds have a very large and growing capacity to invest in infrastructure, both here and abroad. So that represents a really significant potential source of domestic funding if the conditions are right.
Okay, so let's try and summarize this whole deep dive then. It seems pretty clear that the increasing costs of building public transit in Canada are a really significant issue, a major concern.
Definitely.
And it appears to be closely linked to how we plan and execute these projects that project delivery regime idea and also the governance structures that oversee them.
The management and the oversight, yeah.
The comparisons with international projects, even if they're just broad comparisons, they do suggest that there's potentially considerable room for improvement here. Maybe substantial cost savings are possible.
The potential seems to be there, yes.
And the key recommendations coming through seem to be around building stronger in-house expertise within our public transit agencies.
Becoming that smart client.
Right. Implementing clearer and more effective project management practices, maybe smaller contracts, and establishing more stable, predictable, long-term policy frameworks. All those seem critical.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the main points. While Canada is making significant investments in infrastructure, which is good,
Sure.
the really key question emerging is whether we are truly maximizing the value of those investments.
Are we getting the best bang for our buck, essentially?
We need to critically examine if we're getting the best possible return for the billions being spent.
Okay. So here's maybe final thought for our listeners to consider, something to mull over. Given all the evidence and arguments we've explored today, what fundamental shifts in our approach do you believe are necessary to ensure that Canada's infrastructure investments truly deliver the greatest possible value for citizens, both now and well into the future? Should we be fundamentally rethinking our governance models for public transit, maybe looking more seriously at models like Vancouver's? Do our procurement strategies, like the use of AFPs, need a major overhaul or just better management? And maybe most importantly, how can we possibly create a more stable and predictable long-term planning environment for infrastructure development, one that can maybe withstand those inevitable political shifts?
Those are the crucial questions, aren't they? Really big questions for us to be asking as a country. And if you, the listener, are interested in exploring any of these complex topics further, we really encourage you to delve into the original sources that have informed our discussion today.
Definitely worth a look. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.